We've witnessed some amazing events in the United States that none of us have seen in a lifetime. In my view, nothing fundamental will change with the election of Joseph Biden, President of the United States. He will introduce some cosmetic changes and eliminate some of the more overt racist sexism and right-wing reactionary moronic language that he used on denying COVID, essentially. But nothing fundamental will change. The day after Biden was seated, he sent additional troops into Syria to secure the oil in the northeastern part of the country. He's in the Obama tradition. His new cabinet is virtually all Obama and Clinton era people. He wants to continue in that tradition. And I remind you, Obama conducted 7 simultaneous imperialist wars. He was the world's greatest fracker. He deported 3 million people. He gutted social legislation and introduced and supported and expanded the Patriot Act and expanded the surveillance state. So today, the United States can literally look in on, through televisions and computers and other electronic devices, every single person in the United States. They collect something like 3 billion pieces of data on individuals every few minutes. And that includes their spy apparatus around the world. It was the Democrats that increased Trump's proposal for the annual $1 trillion war budget by $50 billion. It was the Democrats who supported all of Trump's bailout procedures. The Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department in the United States combined to gift the ruling class and the corporate elite the equivalent of the total loss of GDP, $6 trillion the first quarter alone. So there will be a little bit more civility in Washington, as exemplified by the fact that they're permanently stationing 25,000 troops in Washington, D.C., that they're setting up commissions to discuss threats to the United States, and we're sure here on the left that it will go way beyond investigating the right. Yes, Trump will, the Biden administration will reestablish relations with NATO, will reconnect to the World Trade Organization and the International Climate Conference. But in all of those things, the American ruling class participated in the same spirit that they had forever, and that is to seek economic and financial and military advantage to maintain U.S. corporate interests. There'll be no fundamental change by the Biden administration on climate. What's unusual today is there is a significant rise of the far right. Trump got some 70 million votes, some 5 to 7 fewer than Biden. But we haven't yet seen a full explanation of these votes. Remember, before Trump, the United States elected the first Black president, Barack Obama, with significant support everywhere. As far as mobilizations in the United States, there were some 500, perhaps 800 who took over the White House on January 6th. and at best 25,000 people who accompanied them. But in the summer of last year, we had the largest demonstrations in the history of the United States, with an estimated 20 million people in the Black Lives Matter movement protesting the systemic racism in the United States, accompanied by a huge swath of working class white youth in 2,000 cities across the country. Nothing has happened like that anywhere in the world, except for, of course, the strike in India of 250 million workers and peasants. But the United States is alive with a movement that is extremely affected and discontented with American capitalism. Even in among the youth, all of the national polls recently show that a majority of youth under 30 prefer socialism to capitalism, which is a bit of a counter to the myth that the United States is turning into a nation of right-wing fanatics. The crisis we have, if anything, is not a crisis in understanding the horrors of capitalism. It's a crisis of leadership in the working class, and I admit to an unprecedented disintegration of the United States left. The largest organization, for example, the ISO, literally dissolved. Solidarity dissolved into the Green Party and the DSA. The Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, claims some 50,000 members, but at their national online convention, the vote was 80% to support Bernie Sanders for president of the United States. The DSA has always been an adjunct for the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders is the chief sheep herder for the Democratic Party, a lifelong sheep herder. And even though he is formally an independent, no Democrat in his state, Vermont, ever seriously runs against him. The Obama administration supported Bernie Sanders in his last election campaign. As the Democratic Party always does, he's in the Democratic Party caucus, and his voting record for the Democrats is something like 97%. But America needs some sheep herders, and the Democratic Party is the historic graveyard of social movements. That's what it's there for. We saw the phenomena of the combined forces of virtually every NGO, non-governmental organization, civil rights organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League, and even the quote leadership of Black Lives Matter converging unanimously to organize the vote for Joseph Biden for president of the United States. Joseph Biden was supported by the US ruling class in all of its manifestations. More American billionaires supported Biden than Trump. The military supported Biden, not Trump, with the Democrats regularly publishing articles and advertisements showing that they had the majority of the generals and officers and national security official people and billionaires and corporate executives and oil magnates, not to mention former presidents of the United States like George Bush, and 80 of the Bush elite signed on to support Joe Biden. That is, Trump was an embarrassment to the ruling class, and they decided to dump him. And big time they did. They were disturbed that he would threaten to negate the results of the elections and declare himself president, as he did on election day, and even threatened, if there were mass protests in the street, to literally call out the National Guard to quell massive opposition should he declare himself president. But that never happened for a number of reasons, the strangest of which is in the face of Trump's coup threat, which not too many people took seriously, the Democratic Party and most of all of the petty bourgeois left and the environmental and social movement and NGOs orchestrated a shutdown of every social movement that they had control of. So there were no protests when Trump said he might declare a coup. Trump lost 60 out of 60 of his lawsuits in the bourgeois courts. The Supreme Court rejected his appeal. He fired basically his own Secretary of State. He virtually dismissed his vice president. He terminated or replaced his top military officials. His Joint Chief of Staff publicly denounced him. So he didn't have much support in the US ruling class. They counted on spending a small fortune. If I were to ask you now to guess how much the United States ruling rich spent on the Americans on elections, you'd be shocked. It was the largest amount, almost by double of any place anywhere in the world. In the United States, $13.6 billion were spent minimally on the elections, with the Democrats outspending the Republicans 2-1. So the ruling class backed Biden 100%. Racist, warmongering, sexist, environmental destroying Trump was repudiated by the ruling class, who intend to carry out the same policies with the thin veneer of civilization that Trump carried out. The same granting of billions, if not trillions of dollars in bailouts to the ruling class. The same racist policies that enforce inequality in the United States. It was President Clinton, the Democrat, who, quote, ended welfare as we knew it. It was President Obama, whose deportation machine and his ICE internal in the immigrant control system oversaw the deportation of millions of Americans. It was the Biden administration that set up the cages for deported children on the Mexican border. And it was the Obama administration that oversaw the near genocide in the Middle East, in the war on Syria, in the war against Central America, in the actions to sanction Venezuela. But the Obama administration did it with a smile. Trump did it with pure hate. Needless to say, Trump is an insane egomaniac, science denier. But the American government policies with regard to climate change, devastating effects, are no different under Biden. Today, the United States faces the gravest combination of crises in history: a massive economic crisis, a massive environmental crisis, which is exemplified by the event in Texas, where the state with the largest oil resources ran out of gas. The place was frozen stiff. A massive social crisis of institutional racism, disproportionately affecting, in COVID-19 terms, the poorest of the poor. A massive crisis in healthcare. On the employment level, despite the formal figures, some 40% of the eligible workers in America don't have jobs. And additional numbers work in the gig economy, working for low wages, flexible hours, in quotes, and no security. 1 out of 5 American families can't pay their rent every month and wonder where the rent money is going to come from. Evictions are at historic highs. The Biden administration has very little answer to any of these things, and neither did the Trump administration. And the reason is because of the inherent contradictions of American capitalism, exacerbated by Trump, but not fundamentally different from the situation that Biden is going to deal with. American capitalism and the world system is in crisis. Trump got elected because the Democrats oversaw the continued offshoring of American jobs to low-wage places like China. The US ruling class sent jobs to low-wage China, where they could have teenage women working 70 to 90 hours a week in dormitory factories for 6 cents an hour. The Chinese ruling class sold their young people, women in particular, to American multinational corporations. And when the Chinese turned around and used some of the modern technologies to, over a decade after it joined the WTO, use its own technology to surpass Americans, then we had a serious trade war, the consequences of which Trump tried to unilaterally address. And the United States government will try to do the same, to isolate China. My party, Socialist Action, considers China to be a rising imperialist power, and the same with Russia, but on a qualitatively different scale than the United States. China has one military base outside its borders in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa. The United States maintains 1,100 military bases. A combination of England, France, and Russia have 30 military bases. The United States has military bases in 100 countries around the world. So, for example, in our view, the United States organized the NATO coalition Gulf state monarchy slaughter in Syria that took the lives of 500,000 Syrians. The Russians, when asked by the Syrian government, a bourgeois government to say the least, for aid, when the US-backed forces, including ISIS, occupied 2/3, if not 3/4 of Syria, and were on the outskirts of Damascus, lobbing rockets in, ready to take over and planning the division of Syria. Syria had the right to exercise its self-determination and ask for Russian aid. We didn't oppose that. We didn't oppose when the United States attempted to starve Venezuela and kill 50,000 people because of hunger and malnutrition and disease, and embargo and sanction Venezuela, not allowing it to sell its own oil, stealing its own oil reserves, resources, banks across the country. We didn't object when Venezuela asked for Russian and Chinese ships for military aid. Any serious revolutionary in Venezuela or Syria would support their governments militarily against the onslaught of US imperialism, while simultaneously seeking to build revolutionary socialist parties to organize workers to fight for their own class interests against their own national bourgeoisie. But if we were in Venezuela, we would be in the forefront of opposition to a literally serious US coup that included troops on both East and West Venezuela aimed at overthrowing the government, paying off the military, and establishing a US banana republic. We had no objection when the Venezuelans called for Russian aid. So we live in a complex world. We got through the incident of having an egomaniac, narcissist, nutcase president who perhaps thought that if the Democrats mobilized millions of people in the street to challenge his coup, he could then be justified in calling on his generals to use mass force to put down a rebellion. But that was a pipe dream of Trump. He had nothing but petty maneuvers, including, in the end, encouraging some 500 extreme right-wing neo-fascist maniacs to occupy the most guarded city in the United States. And they occupied the Capitol building in an astonishing way, where the entire National Guard and police force basically limited itself to a handful of people, while 500 or perhaps 800 maniacs, Proud Boys, three percenters and other neo-fascist types literally pushed a bunch of cops aside and occupied the Capitol building with 450, 550 members of the U.S. Senate and House present in the building, fearful of their lives. It was an unbelievable spectacle. Imagine Trump himself literally on the phone to his fellow Democrats, Republicans, asking them to vote to not certify the Biden presidency, while a mob of 500 or 800 people are threatening the lives of US senators and congressmen. This is the pipe dream of a maniac. No one supported it in the ruling class, but I wouldn't be surprised if future investigation discovers that it was Trump himself and other hierarchy in the police department, who are all pro-cop and many of them racist bigots, conspired to stay away while the building was occupied. But even if the occupiers took over the US Senate, they couldn't stop the American behemoth for conducting its electoral business. The ruling class wouldn't tolerate it. The FBI and the CIA heads refused to back Trump, and he threatened to fire them, as well as military officials, heads of his national security state, all turned against him. So what do we have in the future? We have in the future another round of American imperialist power competing as it has before with all the weapons in its hand against its allies to secure a failing capitalism in the context of a US and world capitalist crisis for which the tops have no solution other than out of the hides of American workers.